Our first speaker is the former finance minister of Greece. He resigned when he refused to accept more austerity. In his own words, he's worried about the state of the European Union and a Eurozone in disintegration and a lack of productivity. He'll now share his insight on economy. Next 12, please welcome Yanis Varoufakis.
Thank you very much.
Welcome.
Thank you. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great privilege and an honor to be here in Denmark, the country that initiated the very interesting concept of negative interest rates, which then spread to other parts of Europe. You only have to state it, negative interest rates, to realize that there is something rotten in the kingdom of Europe. It's also a country that has given us Niels Bohr. I was thinking of Niels Bohr in the Eurogroup meetings that I attended. There were about 10 or 11. Every time I was in there, I thought of Niels Bohr. Now, why would I think of a Danish physicist in the Eurogroup? Because I read in his autobiography some years ago a very funny story, which I want to remind you if you have read it or to tell you if you haven't. In it, he recounts a visit that he had at his country home by another physicist who noticed upon entering the house that there was a horseshoe pinned on top of the door. And he turned to Niels and said, "Niels, I can't believe that you think that this will ward off evil spirits." And Niels Bohr turned around and said, "No, of course I don't believe in that, but my housekeeper tells me it works even if you don't believe in it." Now, you may just have gathered why it is that, oh, by the way, my clock is not counting down, so I'm starting from scratch. It's counting down now. In the Eurogroup, it felt as if all of us together were pursuing policies that no one really believed in, but everybody hoped that they would work anyway, especially if we don't believe in them. Now, the title for my talk today is a very economically serious title. It's about the slowdown in productivity throughout Europe. Now, productivity is influenced by at least three factors. One is, of course, the intensity and quality of labor. Another is the intensity and quality of capital equipment. But there is a third, often forgotten variable, which is very important. It's aggregate demand or sectoral demand, demand for the goods that are being produced or the services that are being provided. Because when there is a downturn, a very serious downturn, a very sharp downturn, many companies, especially after the terrible experiences of the previous downturn of the late 1970s, early 1980s, when they shed labor very quickly, and then during the upturn, they found it very hard to rehire skilled labor. More recently, especially after 2008, there was a lot of labor hoarding. Companies in Germany, in Britain, even in the United States, preferred not to fire en masse workers when demand came down, so they hoarded labor. And therefore, because productivity is a ratio, you have output in the numerator, and you have number of workers or hours worked in the denominator. So if you simply have a reduction in output because there is a reduction of sales, because there is a reduction in aggregate demand, it seems as if productivity has suffered. But productivity hasn't really suffered in the sense that labor or capital or land has become less productive. So in a nutshell, let's get this out of the way. The reason why European productivity is so low is because we have a serious dearth of aggregate demand. And that is connected to the wonderful gift that Denmark has given to Europe, negative interest rates. Well, you haven't given it to us. You were the first to cotton on to the fact that we have a major incongruity in the heart of our European economy. Actually, it's three major incongruities. We have three paradoxes that are simultaneously creating havoc in the foundations of our economy. Allow me to enumerate them, what they are. And they are related, both to low productivity and to negative interest rates. The first incongruity is that we have a level of savings which is much higher than the level of investment. So we have a glut of savings, we have excess savings, savings in excess of investment, that have reached a level never seen in the history of capitalism. So take Germany, for instance, which actually is a very good example, because Germany is an economy that has weathered the storm of the last 6-7 years reasonably well. It has almost a balanced federal government budget. It has a current account surplus of 8-9%, remarkable net exports. It has very low unemployment, and yet you have a situation where you've got, in Germany as we speak, this is pretty mind-boggling, the lowest level of investment since 1945, and very high levels of savings. Now, why is this a problem? Well, think about it. One of the few things we economists know, there is not much we know. We assume a lot, and we know very little. The one thing, possibly the only thing we know, is that the excess of savings over investment plus the budget surplus of the government sector must necessarily equal the current account surplus. This is an identity. The only reason why we know it is because it's an identity. It's like saying A must equal A. It is that sophisticated. It's really not sophisticated at all. Yeah? So savings minus investment, savings over investment, plus taxation, the tax take of the government minus government expenditure, must equal exports minus imports. Very simple. Yeah? So when savings exceed investment massively, and we try to consolidate because of our fiscal pact, let's say, or a general fear that the money markets are going to crash us if we have a budget deficit, what happens? The right-hand side of the equation, of the identity, must be positive. If excess savings are positive, the budget surplus or deficit tends to zero, we balance the books of the government. That means that we're pushing for a massive current account surplus. And this is indeed what has been happening. If you look at the Eurozone as a whole, even Greece has moved to a current account surplus, or at least it has eliminated a chronic current account deficit. Italy, Spain, Ireland, Germany, everybody's exporting, which of course destabilizes the global economy because we're exporting at deflation. Because my net exports are your net imports. Now, let's say, who cares about the rest of the world? Fine. We care because when there is a natural tendency as a result of this identity and the fiscal pact that we have in the Eurozone for the current account surplus to rise, there is also a natural tendency for the euro to rise, which cancels the attempt of Mario Draghi, the president of the European Central Bank, to create aggregate demand in order to replace the loss of investment by printing 80 billion a month. So this effort, the 80 billion, is annulled. So we have a fiscal policy that effectively cancels out the monetary policy. So that's incongruity number one. Incongruity number two, related to it, and it's very significant, is that we have this unique example in human history where we are printing 80 billion a month, therefore crashing interest rates. This is why the Danish central bank had to push interest rates below zero in order to prevent the revaluation of your currency that would kill off your growth or prospects of growth. And at the same time, you have a policy at the monetary level of printing money which is failing to increase the supply of money. Do you get this? We are printing 80 billion a month, and we are failing to increase the supply of money. The quantity of money in the economy is not rising. Why? Because businesses are not investing the money that Mario Draghi is printing. What do they do with it? If you ask the large corporations that borrow money that has been minted by the European Central Bank, what they do with it, you'll find that they're not investing it. At least they're not investing it in productive capacity. So what do they do instead? Well, they buy back their own shares. But that's not an investment. That creates asset price inflation, share prices go up, but the investment which is low, which is the, if you want, the root of the problem, remember, savings money investment is very high because investment is very low. This is not being cured. And the balance sheet of the central bank expands. And what is the result? Low productivity, low investment, and, this is, I suppose, pertinent to your predicament, increasing volatility. Because when you have ultra-low interest rates, negative interest rates, and you have pension funds that are being crushed by them, while at the same time equities have a tendency to go up because of the money printing and the share buybacks, you have a lethal combination. A lethal combination of volatile fixed income and equities. In that environment, it is impossible to be prudent. It is impossible to do the right thing, that is to borrow in order to invest in productive capacity, because you fear that since investment is so low, aggregate demand will be low, so your investment will produce goods and services that will not find the appropriate demand, so you don't invest. So exactly like Oedipus, going back to ancient Greece, or actually Oedipus' father, who heard the prophecy that his son would murder him, tries to kill off the baby before it grows up to murder him, and the result is that the child murders him. Because the shepherd that was given the baby to kill, in the end, doesn't, and then the boy grows up, doesn't know that the king is his father and kills him. So it's exactly the same thing. We are caught up in a web of negative expectations that are self-confirming. And the result is low productivity, low investment, and volatility. Now, Nomura, very recently, decided to get out of the equity business in Europe. Why did they do that? Because they thought that the volatility in Europe, as a result of the process which I have described to you, is such that either you go all in and you put all your eggs in the equities basket in Europe, and you try to overcome the volatility by investing a huge amount of money, or you get out. A halfway house is not possible. This binary distribution of subjective probabilities is, if you want, a major impediment to sound investment and a great deal of uncertainty, a source of uncertainty for the financial sectors. So, does this mean that we are helpless? There's nothing we can do? No, not at all. Imagine, and I'll just leave you with this piece of imagining, just to finish off on an optimistic note. Optimistic note that we don't have to be like Niels Bohr's joke. That we don't have to keep replicating policies we know will not work, hoping that they will. Mario Draghi, your central bank, central banks everywhere, including the Bank of Japan, indulge in expanding their balance sheets, printing all these digital units of currency, purchasing what? Public debt and structured derivatives of mortgages, of various instruments of private finance. But that is not yielding investment. Imagine that the European Investment Bank, which you own, the Germans own, the British own, the Greeks even, a small part of it, the Spanish, we all own together. Imagine that the European Investment Bank were to be given by the European Union Council the green light to effect an investment in green energy and green technologies up to 5–6% of European Union GDP. Through funding it through an issue, a very large issue, of EIB bonds. The reason why the EIB won't do this now, without the green light from the European Union Council, is because they're really scared that if they issue all these bonds, their yields will go up, and they will lose their AAA rating. But if, at the same time, our central banks make the announcement that instead of buying bonds, instead of buying mortgages and structured mortgages and so on and so forth, they will be buying these EIB bonds at whatever level is necessary in order to make sure that their yields remain constant. Suddenly, we're going to have a Green New Deal for Europe. The very announcement of such a policy would suffice to change this bad equilibrium of low productivity, negative interest rates, and substandard investment. In other words, we don't have an excuse for sitting on our hands and adopting the Niels Bohr strategy. It is a matter of will, it's a matter of political nous, but it's also a matter of pressure from people like you, for people out there, upon governments and bureaucrats to get off their hands and actually address this unnecessary, constant, volatility-producing, slow-burning recession. Thank you very much.
We're on time. Yanis, thank you so much. Please join me over here.
I will.
I also have some
With
water
my
for
water.
you. That was quite a lesson you gave us there.
There's water there. There's water everywhere.
Yes. Well, we know we've been struggling with economic turmoil. We've had a near Grexit. We have a looming Brexit ahead. We have a refugee crisis that challenges the very principle of open borders. And some of the things you described just seems way over at least my head. And I'm just thinking, if you sit out there and you're thinking about productivity, how should you actually address this topic, this problem right now?
Well, you can't address it from sitting down there.
No. Okay, I'll say, what should they do?
And you can't
do
address it at the level of your firm.
Mm.
The productivity slowdown is a secular slowdown due to the very low level of aggregate investment. And this is what we are all caught up in. Even though we all have an incentive to boost investment in order to boost productivity, nobody has an incentive to do it if they think that others won't do it. So there is a threshold of a minimum expectation of aggregate investment before everybody has an incentive to invest. So here we have what we, in economics we refer to as multiple equilibria. We have more than one equilibrium. We have good equilibria and we have bad equilibria. And whether we manage to escape the bad equilibrium to go to a good one depends on coordination. And the markets can't coordinate during a slump when interest rates are negative. This is why you need the kind of policy that I have advocated. What you can do is you can position yourself in two ways. Firstly, to make sure that you don't make halfway house choices. I gave an example before. Choose whether you want to go into equities, choose which sector you want to invest in. Spreading thinly around doesn't work in this environment because of the great volatility. But of course, there are very, very great risks. And the second part of the posture that I recommend is pressurize your governments to pursue the aggregate policies for investment, which are necessary to crowd in private investment from everyone like you.
When you were Minister of Finance in Greece before your own exit, and we'll get back to that, you said that the politician had the chance to reboot the Eurozone and thereby also productivity, but they choose political denial. What did you mean by that?
Well, let me give you an example. I think it was the second week I was minister. I was engaged on that particular day of the story in very long discussions with people from the IMF and from the Commission, but primarily from the International Monetary Fund. We had 10 hours of deliberations at the level of our technocrats, politicians, bureaucrats, and so on and so forth. After midnight, I was sitting in a hotel lobby, having a drink with a top-ranking person in the IMF. And to my horror, this person, whose name will go unsaid, but you can imagine who it is, said to me something that horrified me. This person said to me that I was right in my rejection of the policies that they were being implemented in Greece for 5-6 years. And you know what? I panicked because deep down, a maverick like me likes to think that he's wrong and that the people who have the power know what they're doing. When they tell me that I'm right, I think, oh my God. Okay? Number one, strike number one. Strike number two. This person then said to me, but Yanis, you must understand, this is what you were asking about. Yes. You must understand we have invested so much political capital in this fiscal consolidation program of yours that we can't go back on it. So the first point was that program cannot work. The second point was they need to persevere with it. This is panic-inducing. And the third part, which was the most sinister, was I was told that for my credibility, for me to gain credibility, not amongst people like you, but amongst the powers that be, I must accept that program. So you can see what's going on. This is why I was referring to the Niels Bohr paradox. They don't believe in it. They know it's going to fail. But their political capital has been invested in it so much so, and there is no mechanism of democratic control of overthrowing them if they fail, that they feel the need to keep perpetuating it.
Yanis, in former interviews, I've seen that you often cite the movie The Matrix, or use it as an example when we talk about the European Union.
Oh, no. This is not my example of the European Union.
Well, it's not the state of what we're in sometimes. And you have said that capitalism is going to eat democracy.
Well,
I just wonder, does it look a bit like this? Let's just have a clip of, I know it's one of your favorite movies.
okay.
Have you ever had a dream, Neo, that you were so sure was real? What if you were unable to wake from that dream? How would you know the difference between the dream world and the real world?
This can't be. Be what? Be real?
It's going into replication.
Hey, Pop.
Still nothing. Let's go. Let's go.
Tank, we're going to need a signal soon.
Yes, this was, of course, a short clip from The Matrix. I know a movie that you enjoy. Is the state of the Eurozone really that bad? Are we, if we don't look out, as you say, are we near the end?
Well, I have to make the point that this is not a metaphor I use for the Eurozone. It's a metaphor I use for the technological innovations that we are creating today throughout the world, globally, in China, in America, everywhere. Come to think of it, this is not my idea, this is a quite prevalent one. We are moving into a world in which it's very possible that when machines pass the Turing test, and they can pass as humans in the service sector, maybe that will be the first time since the beginnings of capitalism when technological innovation will destroy more jobs in the service sector, in particular, than it will create. And when that happens, we are going to face a situation where we will have the capacity to produce immense wealth, but the vast majority of, or a very large majority of our population will be unemployable. And then, but you know, come to think of it, that's a great opportunity. Because there are two movies that I would like to use as two potential paths. One is we move towards a Star Trek kind of world, in which machines are slaves. We don't have to work. There is a hole in the wall, and it produces anything you want. And we can sit here and have philosophical discussions, explore the universe, learn Klingon, or whatever, right? And that is a wonderful utopia. Technology in the service of humanity. The Matrix I use as an alternative path leading to a situation where humans have become slaves to the machines that they've created, and we have a dystopia. It is perfectly capable to end up with a dystopia with the 0.1% of the population owning machinery and technologies that are capable of remarkable wealth creation, but society falling into the misery and the social conflict that is the result of having a very large segment of the world's population incapable of reproducing themselves as dignified human beings. And whether we go to a Star Trek world or a Matrix world, that is a matter for politics. It's not a matter for technology. Technology will give us an opportunity to go either to a utopia or to a dystopia. But this is the indispensability of politics and of democracy.
And then we're back to productivity and the politics, because you've said that if we don't reconfigure and reunify the political and economic sphere, we could end up in a very bad situation. But how do we actually do that? How do we do that?
Well, come to think about this, when capitalism began in places like Amsterdam and in Britain, democracy was a dirty word. Let me remind you that there is a fundamental difference between liberalism and democracy. Great liberals like John Stuart Mill were against democracy. They believed that the process of electing and having elected representatives is a very inefficient way. He didn't believe in it. It's very late in the piece that we started becoming liberal Democrats. And when did that exactly happen? When power shifted from the political sphere to the economic sphere. Once upon a time, if you were the despot, you had political and economic power. Capitalism created the division between political and economic power. Suddenly it was possible to have economic power if you were a merchant, during the commodification drive with the establishment of international trade routes. Suddenly, dirty people, people that the aristocracy didn't want to touch or see, suddenly they acquired economic power. So you have this division between economic and political power. And capitalism made this division even greater. And increasingly, power shifted from the political sphere to the economic sphere, while democracy was developing in the political sphere. It's a bit like the feminization of professions. So when women enter into a profession, it's a time when the profession goes down in status. Similarly, when the masses get access to political power shifts, or power is lost from the political sphere and it goes to the economic sphere. And there's a great danger. Well, in the European Union, we've already more or less come to the worst possible outcome. Because come to think of it, in the European Union, we have a great paradox. We have democratically elected governments, prime ministers, ministers of finance, and so on and so forth. But all power, all decision-making goes to Brussels, where we send our ministers and prime ministers. But the bodies that make the decision are really not answerable to any sovereign parliament. So, in my experience, we would have the Eurogroup, right? And then we would all go home, and no one would defend the decision of the Eurogroup. I wouldn't, of course, because it was imposed upon me. It was terrible for my country. It was terrible for Europe from my perspective. But Dr. Wolfgang Schäuble did not defend it either. He would go to the Bundestag and say, oh, this is a terrible agreement, but it was the best I could do. The Portuguese, the same. The Spaniards, the same. And there is no people who can actually say to the Eurogroup, come here. You made the decision collectively, right? We don't like it. We'll fire you. In Denmark, you can do it. You can say to your government, the decisions you've made have been abysmal. Off you go. But in Europe, the European Union Council, the Eurogroup, ECOFIN, the European Central Bank are outside the realm of democratic politics, even though all the representatives have been elected democratically. This democratic vacuum, people say that the European Union is not sufficiently democratic. No. It's like being on the moon in your spacesuit, taking your helmet off and thinking, oh, there is an oxygen deficit. There's no oxygen deficit. There is no oxygen.
That's a good point. Well, recently you established a pan-European movement called DiEM21, and I guess you see that as a part of a solution to make more transparency in Europe, and we'll get back to that. Before we dive into that perspective, I'd just like to challenge you a bit, because can you tell us what you think you have in common with Mexican actress Salma Hayek, country singer Carrie Underwood, and then, of course, you, the man on stage, Yanis Varoufakis? What do you have in common?
I have no idea.
You have no idea? Well, I can imagine why. Well, I can tell you all turned up for meeting at Downing Street number 10, all dressed in leather jackets. And I did a lot of research on Google for that one.
Okay.
But the reason I bring this up is because you're known for your laid-back style. You're very anti-establishment. Is this your way to kind of say, let's just talk about the real picture instead of etiquette and diplomacy and so on? Is this your way of saying, let's have straight talking?
Look, it's my way of understanding the world we live in. I'm an academic, really. I'm not serious. I'm not a politician. I ended up accidentally being a politician. All my life, I was in universities. And what do you do as a university lecturer, thinker, teacher? You subvert your own thinking. You try to push the boundaries of what you think you know. This is the only way that experimental science, it's the only way that the scientific process can work, by confronting the dominant paradigm. And this is how societies, healthy societies, should do politics. Recently in Germany, I ended up defending a comedian that did me a lot of harm last year with a video that he showed. But I ended up defending him because we are losing our capacity to be self-critical and to have a dialogue. and to even poke fun at each other and poke fun at ourselves. We're becoming incredibly boring and not ready to evolve. And a Europe that does not evolve, that does not look at itself critically. And, you know, let me give you an example. For an academic, my predicament in the Eurogroup was just mind-boggling. It was unbelievable. I would have a discussion with Wolfgang Schäuble and others, but mainly Wolfgang, whom I actually like very much personally. And I would say to him, you know, this rule that you carry on talking about, let's say the rule about not having a debtor structure, which actually there's no such rule, but he made it up. This rule, which you think is a rule of the European Union, is impossible to enforce, and if you try to enforce it, you end up with a deeper bankruptcy that you started with. And the answer was, yes, but this is the rule. Yes, but why it is the rule? Because it is the rule. Why is it the rule? Because it's the rule. That's not the conversation. You can't, you know, convince me that this is the right rule. Don't just keep repeating to me that it is the rule. Because in the end, you see, we're Europeans. We have to ask ourselves a very important question. America is a basket case. There's no doubt about that. Just look at whom they're about to elect. But they are pragmatic people. In 2008, when Wall Street imploded, 10 people got around the table. In the Treasury, in the Central Bank, in the Federal Reserve, in the White House. They got together and they asked themselves the right question. How do we stop this crisis from consuming us? Yeah? What was the question that we asked here in Europe? They got together around the table and they asked the question, okay, the rules don't work. How can we pretend that they work? It's not the same question. The answer you give to the second question is catastrophic.
But Yanis, just very shortly, because we're running out of time and I prepared so many questions, but this DiEM25, this pan-European movement that you just established, how do you see that as a solution to the establishment, to all the problems that you kind of told us about today?
In my estimation, Europe is disintegrating. The refugee crisis is just a manifestation of much deeper problems. We have an architecture with faulty foundations that are getting worse and more brittle by the day because of the mishandling of the economic crisis. And then when you're on top of that, you add the refugee crisis, which we should be able to fix very easily. The building is not strong enough to sustain it. I'm very critical of the European Union. Nobody can accuse me of being a loyalist to Brussels. But, having said that, if we allow the European Union to disintegrate, we're going to end up in a postmodern 1930s, with Europeans turning against one another, with deflation, with stagnation and stagflation in the Latin parts and the Mediterranean in Greece. We are going to become a vortex that will bring down the whole of the planetary economy. We are perfectly capable, we're big enough and capable enough of creating a massive crisis worldwide, and one that unleashes catastrophic, vulgar, brutish forces here in Europe of the kind that we haven't seen since the 1930s. You only have to look at the ultranationalism, the xenophobia, the racism, which is emerging everywhere as a result of this failure of the European Union disintegration. And I asked myself the question, what is the only way of stopping it? And the answer I give is similar to the answer we should have given, but didn't, as Europeans, in 1930, immediately after the Wall Street collapse then, and the fragmentation of the currency union of that period, which was the gold standard, very similar to the euro. What should we have done in 1930? As Democrats in Denmark, in Germany, in Greece, in Spain, independently whether we're left-wing, right-wing, progressive conservatives, as long as we're Democrats, we should have formed a pan-European alliance to stop the slide into the abyss. This is what DiEM, the Democracy in Europe movement, is trying to do.
Well, we wish you luck on that. Today's topic is the next 12, and it's been very inspiring to hear your thoughts here today. And you're an economist and you're a thinker. I'm just thinking, if you're sitting down there in their shoes, what would you say to them they have to pay extra attention to towards the next 12? What would you say is the most important thing?
For 12 days, months, or years?
No, next 12 months, the next 12.
Well, my view is that it is impossible to predict the way in which this volatile, crisis-ridden economy of ours is going to evolve. You can see that one day there is a prediction that oil prices will go to 0, the next day it will go to 150. China is collapsing, China is moving ahead, Germany is going to be in trouble, France. So it's impossible. Don't waste your time trying to predict. Just concentrate on becoming better at what you do. And I think that applies to everyone. And especially if you're in business, try to find ways of maximizing the productivity, not competitiveness, the productivity of your labor force and of your capital without exposing yourself to the kind of silly instruments that the financial sector wants to peddle.
Yanis, I'd like to leave the audience with an advice. I'd like to ask you, what is the best career advice you ever received in your life?
Oh, do that which you love.
Sorry?
Do that which you love.
Yes.
And don't try to do that which you think is profitable. Because profit is like a beautiful butterfly that comes and sits on your shoulder when you do the right thing. If you pursue it at the expense of quality, of humanity, you will simply fail at being profitable. The butterfly will simply not come to you.
It's been very inspiring. Let's give him a big round of applause. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.